Okay. What is your name?
Ron Duvall.
And tell me about yourself.
Okay. I was born in Laramie, Wyoming. I grew up there. Went to elementary school and all the way through high school there. After I graduated from high school, I served a mission for my church. Went to Santiago, Chile. Lived there for 2 years. When I returned, I went to the University of Wyoming. Majored in acting, and eventually found a young woman that I married. And after we got married, I changed my major and I graduated from the University of Wyoming with a Bachelor's of Arts in psychology. I had to remember what it was I actually graduated with. We moved to Bend, Oregon, where I worked in mental health for a while. Then we decided it was time to get some graduate schooling. Moved to Logan, went to the USU, got a master's degree in management and human resources. Currently I am the human resource manager at West Point Dairy Products here in Hiram. I've been there for several years now. I have 4 kids and a dog and a truck.
What's a good story you know?
Do you want one that happened to me or just a good story?
Good story that happened to you.
A good story that happened to me. Well, I'm being prompted that I should tell you the scarecrow story. I grew up north of town, just in the country, north of Laramie. We didn't have close neighbors. We lived on open range. We actually had to fence out the cattle that the landowner kept out there. And my brothers and I spent our summers exploring the countryside. We found that not too far from us was an old abandoned ranch house, 2-story ranch house, built probably at the turn of the century, so 1900s, maybe even earlier. And it was out there, had been abandoned as long as any of us knew, and continued to be abandoned. We adventured there quite a bit during the summer. But in order to tell you that story, I have to tell you another story. When I was quite young, my grandfather came to town, and he enjoyed taking long walks. And he took me for a long walk one day, I think to get me out of my parents' hair. And we happened upon this abandoned house and explored it. And on the second story, I distinctly remember finding bones and rusty tin cans, empty tin cans. And my grandfather told me that the bones were of the old hobo that lived and died there, and that the tin cans were the cans of food that he had eaten just before he died. And so for the next several years, I remembered the hobo dying in that old house. Well, as my brothers and I got older and started exploring and ventured upon this house again, I remembered in the back of my mind the story of the hobo and the tin cans. Now, even though later I had learned that the bones that we had found were not of the hobo, but of an old horse, and that just, bits and pieces had been drug up there and left, I couldn't shake the idea that there was a hobo that had died and the tin cans he'd starved to death after he'd eaten his cans of beans or porridge or whatever they were. So my brother Steve and I, again later on, ventured into this old house. And you gotta remember that this is an old abandoned house. So it had wood, lath siding, it had plaster walls, and all the wooden windowed frames were all busted out. There were no windows left, no doors left on the building. And it was 2 stories, and you could go in, I believe it was on the north side of the house, and you could go in, and on that side of the house, it was 1 story, with the basement going down from there, and then on the south end of the house, there were the 2 stories. And so we'd always ventured up to the upstairs because the downstairs had been used by cattle and horses over the years and smelled like a barn and looked like a barn and just wasn't very attractive for people to go and explore. So we always ended up going into the upstairs part of it. And the part that you ventured into first happened to have an old water cistern up in the roof. And occasionally, if you got there around twilight, bats would fly out of there, and so that was kind of frightening for us young guys. And occasionally, other varmints and critters were always out there. So my brother Steve and I entered this house. And we entered in on the side, the north side, where we could go right to the first floor, right to the upper floor. And also there was the stairs down in the basement. Well, as we entered in and we were talking and good-naturedly poking fun at each other, I, being the younger brother, was the one that, was going to end up alone, because that's just the way things work when you're the younger brother. So we're headed in, and all of a sudden I discover that I am alone in the upstairs of this old house. And we've already passed the cistern, and I'm looking through the broken windows, and I'm looking through the open doorways without doors, and I'm listening to the wind blow. And if you've ever been in Wyoming, you know that's nothing uncommon. The wind is always blowing. And my brother Steve was gone. I do not know where he went. And I was beginning to get excited, because in the back of my mind I could remember the hobo. Even though I knew he was a dead horse, he was really a hobo. And he died in this house, and there was nothing I could do. The dead hobo was somewhere in that house, and he probably had just nabbed my brother Steve, leaving me alone to be in his clutches soon. So as I went through the upper floor of this house, I began calling my brother Steve's name. Steve, Steve, where are you? No answer. Nothing but the empty windows and the wind. I'd venture forward a little more. Steve, Steve! Getting a little more insistent each time, and still nothing. Finally, I had gone into every room of the upper floor, and nothing. I finally heard a noise indicating that there was movement on the south end of the house. Well, on the upper floor of that house, on the south end, there was a doorway. And if you remember, it's a 2-story building. That doorway opened on to nothing, 1 flight up, with no stairs below, just an empty doorway with an 8-foot drop down to the ground, and nothing. But that's where the noise came from, so I had to investigate. By now I'm frantic. I know the hobo's out there. I know he's gotten my brother, and the noise was most likely the hobo ready to get me, but that's just what you have to do. You have to investigate. So I go to the door, and I'm yelling for my brother, and there's no sound, there's no noise, there's no sign of life except for the wind and the grass blowing back and forth. And finally I enter that doorway, square in, yelling my brother Steve's name. And without provocation, without any sense that it was going to happen, a specter arose from my feet lifted itself up and wrapped its arms around me and fell back into nothingness. Well, I knew the hobo had me. I screamed. I did a dance. I couldn't hardly articulate how frightened I was. And I just stood there. And the specter arose again from my feet, wrapped its arms around me, and fell back into nothingness. This time I found my voice. I yelled, Steve. I screamed, I yelled, and I went running the opposite direction. Well, about that time I hear my brother's voice. Ron, Ron, Ron. And it's my brother Steve, and I'm like, where are you? So I'm running from the house. The specter attacked me twice. The hobo's back there ready to eat me, I'm sure of it. My brother Steve comes running up to me and finds me and says, Ron, Ron, what's wrong? What's wrong? Trying to act surprised and glad to see me. Well, I told him that I was at the door and the thing, and he got me, and he just stood there and took it until he couldn't stand it anymore, and he started laughing. And he brought me very reluctantly back into the house. And we went to the basement. And as we approached the southern door of the basement, there was a form hanging from its feet in the doorway of that basement entrance. And likely, had it not been for my brother, I would have climbed through my skin and would have been 2 counties away if I had my way. But he grabbed hold of me and he dragged me to the end of that building to find that there was a scarecrow that was nailed feet up into the door jamb. And that this door jamb on the lower floor was immediately and exactly below the doorway on the upper floor. And so my brother then demonstrated to me that hitting the scarecrow as hard as he could, the scarecrow would fly up and wrap its arms around whatever was in the doorway up above it and fall back down. And that's the story of the hobo and the scarecrow. Thank you very much.